chapter 6 is where we left off, and the whole entire second half of chapter 6 and the entire chapter of chapter 7 is about adultery. I would say in chapter 6, not committing it, and in chapter 7, not being tempted by the married woman. And those things are tremendously important. Obviously, they have a bearing on wisdom and our moral life. But we've seen that language before, I think in chapter 4 or 5. I think it was chapter 5. And there's not much to be gained by adding to the conversation. If you want to read those through, you certainly can. There's some really good lines in there. There's one about putting fire in your lap, and why would you do that? And the kind of damage you can do to yourself and others by those kind of decisions. But rather than dig in there, we're going to move on really all the way to chapter 9. But before we get there, I do want to mention chapter 8. We have talked during this study that one of the things the book of Proverbs occasionally does is personify wisdom. In other words, it treats wisdom as a character. It gives it a voice, gives it characteristics, and we see that in chapter 8. There's this is almost a first-person narrative. And in fact, I guess you'd say it probably is a first-person narrative, as wisdom describes being created among the first things that God did, being there at the rest of creation, the benefit that she, in this case, it's a feminine word, has to offer others. And even in the back half of chapter 8, a really poetic piece starting in verse 22 with a celebration of wisdom actually participating in the creation of the world. And you get the idea that wisdom is kind of woven into the fabric of what God has done and is in the foundation, in the firmament of our created world. And Michael, anything to add to that?
I would probably say, Clint, that to a relatively well-educated Western audience, we bring with us a lot of assumptions about science and the way that creation came about, and those things are good. Those are things that we've learned over the years. I think, though, to really plumb the depths of what's at hand here, you have to recognize that when you talk about wisdom being present at creation, you're not talking scientifically. You're not talking about scientific principles. You're not talking about getting back to what actually happened, though that sometimes is what we bring to the conversation of creation. What we have here is a far more philosophical question. It would make sense to those in the ancient world who were used to asking questions. What's the best way to live your life? What is the ultimate good as a human? These are things that were just natural to their discourse. And what we see here is that when God created, it was with the optimal life. And one theologian, Stanley Hauerwas, calls that the grain of the universe. And I think we can pull from this that there are some things that when we live that way, when we act and behave and speak in these ways, we're actually participating in what is God's best for creation. And that's a good thing. Whenever we can do that, we're living into what God intended. And that also conversely means that there are actions and things that we can do, Clint, that move us farther away from what God intended. And it is our duty as people of faith, as Christians, to be able to discern that and then seek to be faithful to the one path and not the other.
Yeah, and I think maybe what's helpful about this chapter is the idea that wisdom isn't just the sum of our decisions. Wisdom is an entity. Wisdom is a real thing that tries to guide us and lead us. In fact, those of you who have been Presbyterian for a long time may remember in the mid to late 80s, there was a conference. In fact, it was just up the road in Minneapolis. It was called the Reimagining Conference. And they stirred the pot and ruffled a lot of feathers by having some outlandish worship services, in one of which they prayed to the goddess Sophia, and that created a big stir in the Presbyterian Church. Well, the tie is that the word Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. Sophos is the word wisdom. And so that idea is directly from portions of Scripture like this, in where a feminine character is celebrated as partnering with God, or at least being a part of what God is doing pre-creation. And it's clearly taking it in an unusual direction, but the root of that is this idea that wisdom is not determined by us. Wisdom is bigger than we are, and when we seek to follow God, we are simultaneously seeking the wisdom that God has set in front of us, even in the created order. Now, I think, Michael, when we get to our passages today, we start in verse 7 of chapter 9, we get the exact opposite. In other words, 8 and 9 have this wonderful contrast. Chapter 8 talks about the depth of wisdom, and really in chapter 9 we run headlong into the shallowness of foolishness.
Yeah, the reality is that in one, wisdom is unsearchable in its depths. You can never reach the bottom, but it's also slower going. What we're going to find in the chapters that we turn to today, Clint, is that it's much easier to plumb the depths of the fool because there's really nothing there.
Yeah, and we have this choice to make. And so we jump in verse 7 here, chapter 9. Whoever corrects a scoffer wins abuse. Whoever rebukes the wicked gets hurt. A scoffer who is rebuked will only hate you, but the wise, when rebuked, will love you. Give instruction to the wise, and they will become even wiser. Teach the righteous, and they will gain in learning. So here we begin with this contrast between the scoffer or the fool and the wise person. And the main difference is one is willing to be corrected. And we probably are at our most foolish in our lives when we refuse to listen, when we are beyond when we think we are beyond critique, beyond accountability, when we will not hear a voice that says something other than what we want to hear. This passage points out that that's almost the height of foolishness.
Yeah, they talk about with children that they have this remarkable biological thing called neuroplasticity, that they're just able, their brains are able to be transformed into change. And we've known that for all time. We've not had that language for it, but we've known that children's inquisitiveness, their willingness to use their imaginations to try new things, even if it doesn't go well, we've always known that curiosity contributes to their willingness, to their ability to grow, sometimes in amazingly fast ways. And if only we could be more like children in that, Clint. When we're rebuked, when someone says you did that wrong, instead of getting up in arms and bringing all of our assumptions with us, if we were willing to listen, to be changed, that would be a far better path over the course of a lifetime than immediately assuming that we know the right answer.
Yeah, we're not there yet, but down the road a ways in Proverbs, there is a saying that says the wounds of a friend can be trusted. And the point is that the wise are willing to learn that they're wrong. The wise are willing to hear dissenting voices because it may, in fact, teach them something. The fool is unteachable. The fool already believes they know what they need to know, and therefore there's nothing else that they can hear. They can't process new information, particularly if it doesn't fit with their preconceived ideas. So a difference in approach right away. So continue with verse 10 here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We've seen this before. And the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. For by me your days will be multiplied, and years added to your life. If you are wise for yourself. If you scoff, you alone will bear it. So the idea here is that there is a price to be paid. For wisdom, it's a benefit, and for foolishness, it's expensive. It's a cost. It's negative. So wisdom brings good, foolishness brings bad. No secret there in a book like Proverbs. Now, as we move to the end of the passage, here's where I think we really get a visual, almost a humorous display of what foolishness looks like. So the foolish woman is loud. She is ignorant and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the high places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. You who are simple, turn in here. And to those without sense, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But they do not know that the dead are there, and that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. Sheol being the place of the dead or the place of no hope. And I guess if you find it a little bit offensive that foolishness is portrayed as a woman, you have to balance that with just a chapter ago, wisdom was portrayed as a woman. So I don't know, it might be more comfortable if they had changed language here. But the idea here is that foolishness, is a temptation. She calls people in, and the simple listen. And she says, stolen water is sweet. In other words, cut a corner. Bread eaten in secret is pleasant. In other words, take for yourself. We've seen admonitions against this, but now we see that the foolish listen to this foolishness and they're led astray by it.
Yeah, and those actions which are in some sense temporal, they happen in the now, time and place, they have long-lasting significance. That's what we have at the end here. What you don't know is that the dead are there with her, that road that she's inviting you to take is one that has a sight far beyond the horizon. You don't see it yet, but that path is not a good path. And what I think is interesting here, Clint, is that we do, even in our own culture, have this narrative that says that, the simple path is always the best path. And, it's interesting because Proverbs is going to temper that. We've already said this in the study more than once, that wisdom isn't necessarily complicated. Oftentimes we know what the wise thing is to do. We're just unwilling or unable to live it out. But yet, on the other hand, wisdom is that thing that does have depth, and therefore it is nuanced. There's always more to wisdom than what we're going to know. And foolishness, you run out pretty quickly, right? Foolishness is just merely a dent in the surface. And I think that we should respect, we should give preferential listening and attention to those people in our lives who come to it with the depth of wisdom. If someone can come into a conversation with some complexity and nuance, and they can hold a lot of things in tension, I think that speaks well of a person's insight, their advice. When we come to a person, they say, when they overly simplify what's not a simple thing, I think that should be a reason for us to be concerned. We should question that.
Yeah, I think that we definitely want to understand that foolishness and simplicity are not the same thing. In fact, often there is a simplicity to wisdom, but it's arrived at not because of lack of resources. The wisest people I know have an amazing ability to take complicated and to find in it a simple truth, a simple choice, and to get to the heart of the matter. So when Proverbs uses the word simple, it generally does not use it as a synonym for foolish. However, the simple-minded one, the one who doesn't think things through, the one who doesn't acknowledge right and wrong, the one who approaches things simply, is going to be criticized in this book. Simplicity, I've never really thought of it that way, Michael, but simplicity would be a fascinating lens through which to look at the book of Proverbs. Another interesting lens I think we see right in the last verse here, the idea of life, the idea that foolishness may lead to temporary enjoyment. It may lead to temporary success and wealth if things are stolen or not fairly gained, but that ultimately acts of foolishness do not lead us to life. They're not life-giving. They may bring a season of happiness, but they ultimately move us further and further away from the true meaning of life, which is a godly life, a wise life, a life well lived. And it is that simple in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom leads to life and foolishness to death. Now, that's not to say there aren't moments of glee or happiness along the road, but ultimately the road is taking you to that destination.
You know, one of the things that jumps out to me in this passage today, Clint, is in verse 15, that the foolish woman calls out to those who are passing by, those who are on the straight way, and she's trying to get them to turn off the road. And I think the image that comes to mind for me is really practical. We've been living it now for more than 9 years. You have a kid and you go to Walmart and you're just trying to get milk, right? And every end cap of Walmart was designed for kids, right? Hey, look, sugary drinks. Oh, look, your favorite toy. Oh, look, all this stuff. And like, it's a minefield of staying on the straight path just to get milk, which obviously it's intended to be that way, right? Every parent knows the danger of the checkout line. And I think, Clint, something that simple, trying to teach kids, no, it's worth waiting for good things instead of spending your money on the frivolous things. We know that that's the thing we try to teach our kids. So the same for our lives. How hard is it to walk this straight path that often goes through difficult, sometimes seasons of drudgery? The amount of willpower and commitment and honesty and character that it takes to do that, not just as a child in the simple things, but an adult in the complex and important things. And we should both have grace for ourselves when we make a mistake, but also recognize that it is indeed one of our chief callings as people of faith to walk that straight path.
Yeah, and there is a perseverance in wisdom that holds on because it believes it's the right thing. Wisdom is not always, in fact, often not the easy path, but it is the right path, and this matters a great deal within this book and certainly within Scripture. Well, at chapter 10, we make a transition, and so beginning tomorrow, we will, I'm not exactly sure, Michael, you and I have to talk about the best way to present this, but in chapter 10 following, we really just get what people think of when they think of the book of Proverbs, an ongoing list of random sayings, right, sometimes grouped by subject and often not. And so we may just go chapter by chapter and highlight some of the interesting ones to us. We may try to do this thematically. Between now and then, we will come up with what we think might be a good approach, and hopefully that will make some sense to you. But we do turn a corner tomorrow, so if you get a chance to be with us, things will be a little different starting Wednesday.
Yep, and I think on that note, this is a great time if this study has raised questions for you, maybe questions about the wisdom texts themselves, or maybe some background information. Now would be a great time to ask those. That stuff could be things that we could address as we move forward to the next chapters here. So
yeah, sounds good. Hey, thanks for being with us. Hope you have a great rest of your day. It's been good to spend this time together. Hope to do it again tomorrow.
See ya. Thank you for spending time with us today as we study Scripture together. If you haven't already, we would invite you to follow us on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube. It's a great way to get notified when these studies happen every day at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Of course, if you've already done that, we would love for you to be able to give the video a like, to share it if you're on Facebook. This is a great way for other people to find the Bible study and be able to join us in this time studying Scripture. If this is your first time here, welcome. It's such a joy to have you be with us this day, and we would love to get to know you better. We would love if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to go to our website, fpcspiritlake.org/welcome. We'd love to get your name and email address, and we'll follow up with you personally to thank you for spending time with us this day. And for each and every person that is able to study Scripture and engage in this conversation, we want to say thank you. We look forward to our next time with you every weekday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, God bless.